on the transport industry. And I think that's really important because, as I say, it's about trying to really understand the challenges that everyone is facing. And we need to understand, because we want to encourage women to be playing a much greater role in influencing the transport industry going forward. So that's in the infrastructure, in the building, in the management, the maintenance, in the different forms of communication, in terms of how we get about the modes of transport. Just a real opportunity for us to sort of share all that. So it's 12:03, and I'm conscious that we've got people still joining. We are going to record this session, so I'm hoping that everybody's comfortable with that. It's an opportunity for then those that are maybe not able to stay for the whole session or can't attend the session to be able to see it after. And we're going to be putting it onto the Southwest regional hub of the Women in Transport website. And as I say, we're a very fledgling organisation. We've only just started during the course of this year trying to build up a following within the Southwest. So this is our first virtual event. And as I say, we've had 312 people, which is why it's taking so long for everyone to join, which is just wonderful. But I'm going to thank you all very much for coming. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Jenny Tipping, who is going to be our chair, facilitator and organiser for today. So Jenny, over to you.
Thanks very much, Jill. So yes, I'm Jenny Tipping, and I've worked in the transport industry for about 17 years, firstly as a truck driver and a truck instructor, and now I am a trainer in communication skills and also a coach. So this topic is right up my street. So I was absolutely delighted to be asked to be involved. So I wanted to start by giving you an example of what we're going to be talking about today. So this is an example from my own life. A few years ago, I was speaking on a panel for women in logistics. And when it came to the questions from the floor, the chair asked for everybody to wait until they were called by the chair to ask their question. Within the first 4 questions, 2 men had asked their question without waiting to be called by the chair, and 2 women had started their question with the word sorry. So this is a kind of a perfect example of the kind of thing we're going to be talking about today. Now, when I came to think about this issue again after, because that was a few years ago, I remembered that we were 4 women on the panel and a female chair, and none of us called this out. And I was also aware, in hindsight, having spent much more time now in the transport industry, that the chances are that all 4 of those people asking a question were nervous. The women, because they were quite young and they were speaking in front of a large group of people, but also the men, because they were in that situation in a tiny minority, which is very unfamiliar for them. And I noticed that when we are under pressure, when we are under stress, we tend to resort to our default setting, which is often based on the way that we have been trained to be according to gender stereotypes. And so the default for men was to dominate the situation, to increase their power. And for women, it was to apologise and to diminish their impact. So, and it's this link between the language we use, the way we use it, and our personal power that we're going to be talking about today. So we have 4 fabulous women in the transport industry in the Southwest to talk about this topic, and I'm going to ask them now to introduce themselves. So firstly, Anuradha, please.
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Anuradha. I'm an assistant engineer in Bristol Bridges team for WSP, and I joined the company after graduating from uni 2 years ago.
Lovely, thank you very much. And Bev?
Yeah, hello everyone, I'm Bev Norman. I work for Somerset Council. I started as a technical apprentice within the Highways Group over 30 years ago, and I've worked across a number of disciplines, including highway maintenance, structures and constructing the M5 before specialising in traffic engineering and then the wider field of traffic management about 25 years ago. I've worked my way up over the last 25 years and I'm now hold a position of Strategic Manager, Traffic Management, Road Safety and Parking. I'm responsible for the operations operation and management of the highway network in Somerset.
Lovely, thank you. And Carol?
Hi, I'm Carol. I became a bus driver at 18 years old, which is quite young, and particularly for a woman. I've worked my way up to my current role, which is an operations manager for First West of England. I'm also a nominated transport manager for the company. My network goes from South Gloucestershire all the way up to North Somerset, including Bristol city centre as well. I'm really passionate about everyday sexism, and that's definitely something that feeds into language.
Thank you. And Jo?
Thanks, it's great to see everybody. I'm Jo White. I'm the Roads Development Director in National Highways. I developed my passion for roads back when I did my maths degree over, well, it's actually 30 years ago now. And I've been working in this environment ever since. Really passionate about what I do and the people that surround me.
Lovely. Thank you very much, everybody. So we are hoping that this is going to be a really interactive conversation. So feel free to put your questions in the chat at any time. We'll have questions from the floor towards the end. And we're also going to have 3 polls during the course of this session. So hopefully the details of all of these are just coming up into the chat now. So let's start then with one of those polls. So I'll just give Victoria an opportunity to set it up.
Everyone see my screen? Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Fantastic. So we'll give a couple of seconds to get the details. Perfect. Thank you. I think Tracy has a question.
So is that a hand up for logistics, for practicalities? I'm not really monitoring the chat. Okay, so if you could
This is the first question.
Okay, excellent.
Can everyone let me know if they can? Oh, perfect.
Brilliant, yeah. Okay, so which of these language modifiers do you regularly use? So people have started to vote. So the current winners are sorry but and is that right? So I'll just, while everybody's voting, I'm just wondering if the panelists can see those language modifiers, and are there any that you recognise that you do yourself? Yeah, Jo, you're nodding.
Yes, so in fact I just voted. Sorry but is definitely one of the ones I use regularly, and I think I use that a lot, and I work really hard to reflect on particularly my writing as well as my conversation, because I think we're quite emotional people, so I think seems right to me, but it's all about the context, isn't it? Sometimes it doesn't work and you want to be more direct.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Anybody else?
Yeah, I think I think
so. I'll just go
even
for
in speech now I'm saying it.
Go for Carol. What was that? I think.
Yeah, I think. And I was going to start the sentence with I think. It's I think. It's one I definitely use in verbal, but also when I'm typing. I'm also very conscious that when I'm typing, emotion tends to come out. I feel.
Yeah.
Is another one. It's not on there, but definitely one I use.
Right. Thank you. Bev, did you also start to speak at the same time?
Yeah, sorry. But yeah, I have probably misunderstood is one I use a lot. I think because I'm thinking it's me that's got it wrong, probably, rather than actually questioning other people in to start with, if that makes sense. So quite often I've probably misunderstood. It's probably me. I've probably got it wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. And actually you would, even as we do it without realizing. Yeah. And Anuradha, do you have one?
Similar to Carol, I use I think quite a lot, and I also end a lot of my sentences with am I making sense? I think to just gauge whether everyone's understood what I said.
Yeah.
But yeah, a lot of the time.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, some of them there's perfectly reasonable reasons to use them, and to check that you've been understood is fairly normal. But yes, it is interesting that nobody has put none of the above. So this is obviously something that speaks to people. Excellent. So I think we can close that now. So we'll go back to the full screen. Brilliant. So quite often the language that we use is based on assumptions that we grew up with about women's right to speak. That might be based on the culture we come from, our education, our immediate family. So what assumptions did you bring into the workplace about how women should show up and communicate? So I'll do this in alphabetical order of first names. So Anuradha, we'll start with you, please.
Yeah, so I've always actually been told that these language modifiers will affect your success at work and that it's better to remove these language modifiers if you can. And there are even like social media trends. There was one on TikTok a few months ago that was young women writing emails and deleting all the language modifiers or like the extra smiley faces that we might put in and things like that to seem a bit more, I guess, what they thought that professional would be. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Bev next, yeah.
Yeah, so when I started my technical apprenticeship, I was the only girl. I was the only girl in the workplace. I was the technical female in the workplace, and also at college. And I didn't think my gender would really make a difference, I suppose. Quite naively, I was one of 3 girls. I grew up on a farm, so we could sort of do anything really, and we had, you know, our whole lives in front of us, and the world was our oyster, I think. But when I started work, it really became apparent that actually it was really male dominated, and the only females in the office were assistants and secretaries, and I was all women had to wear skirts and dresses in the office. I had to get special permission to wear trousers. And there were some senior officers that told me they weren't too interested in investing in my career because I was going to leave and have a family, and that their time would be wasted. Now, not everybody was like that, but I think it made me really determined to go that extra mile, to be positive, not to be put down. And so probably just turning that round really. So the language, and I probably use all of those phrases that we listed earlier, just to really trying to go the extra mile probably, and do actually prove that I could do those roles before then being formally offered them. So
right,
yeah, interesting.
Yeah, so for you it kind of lit a fire inside you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. It's like I can achieve that. I will achieve that. By proving myself, I think, and stepping up.
Carol.
Yeah, so my experience is I grew up in the industry, so I was introduced to buses really young. I used to go to work with my dad, and there was a female bus driver who would swear a lot, but she didn't swear any more than the next person who happened to be a male driver, but she was called out for it. And I remember just being told that, well, swearing's really unladylike. So the fact that she swears a lot, even though it was the cultural kind of norm, meant that you can't call her a lady. Well, that was completely irrelevant. Another example is someone once said to me that you need to take more care of your appearance, and then you'll be taken more seriously. And looking back now, I think, gosh, would someone say that to a man in the workplace? Probably not. Therefore, and I think bring it back to the swearing. A kind of a lived experience of mine about a year ago was being in a meeting where I was the only woman, and there were some people in the room, some colleagues who were swearing, but they paused just ahead of the swearing and they would turn to me and they would say, "Really sorry." Then they'd go on and swear. That drives me potty. Just, you're going to do it or you don't do it. Either is fine. Just don't single me out and apologize ahead of doing it.
Yeah, but also hear that your dad took you to work, and so
yes.
Presumably you grew up with the idea that he was quite happy with the idea of you being in buses.
Yeah, oh no, absolutely, yeah. And I think having grown up in it, I didn't really see. I knew it was male dominated, but didn't really see that there was a problem. I then actually took a gap from the bus industry, went and worked in private healthcare. It's having come back to the bus industry that I've suddenly gone, oh, we've got a bit of work to do.
Yeah, thank you. And Jo?
Thanks. And it's really interesting to hear Carol talk about her dad. So I'm the eldest of 2 daughters, and my dad is probably was one of my biggest influences in terms of encouraging me to debate with him. I mean, we had some quite heavy debates over politics and things like that as I was growing up, but I kind of ploughed my own furrow to some degree and did maths, which I think surprised him. But I was in a kind of, you know, the minority really at university, and then moving through the career, you know, often like, you know, I think in all our circumstances, being the only woman in meetings or the only woman sort of participating in certain events. But I never really well, I don't know, not worried about it, but it was just the thing. When I did my maths A level, I was the only girl in the class. When I did my physics A level, I was one of 2, so I kind of was sort of used to it. But you know, one interesting sort of thing I was reflecting on, particularly that Bev's conversation about what you could wear and not wear, which is just shocking, frankly, in these days. But I worked on a project, and the project team all got given ties as a thank you, and I was like, what? I mean, you know, I can wear a tie, there's nothing to stop me wearing a tie, but you know, it was just interesting, the reflection that it was a very male kind of type of you know, wear, you know, dress wear. So just things like that happening to you. But I mean, what I've kind of reflect on is I think I've been quite fortunate. My role models have been male and female. I've been lucky to encounter good people along the way who have given me and been allies in terms of my career, and are, you know, I've got what I call the cheerleaders behind me, sort of trying to help me and give me those opportunities and help sort of push me forward and push me out of my comfort zone quite a lot, but be supportive at the same time.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks very much. Okay, so let's think about kind of leadership and communication styles. So traditionally, more kind of directive approaches to leadership have been associated with men, whereas more collaborative approaches have been associated with women, with the directive being seen as more powerful. And I do think this is shifting. I think there's some beautiful examples in the world now of female leadership. My personal favourite at the moment is Serena Wiegmann. I think she's just a beautiful example of female leadership. So how have you navigated this balance between these 2 styles? Let's start with Carol, please.
I think I've always known that I've got a slightly different view in the workplace to others, and it never occurred to me that gender might actually be the reason for it. I just thought I had a very different way of thinking. So I'm quite used to using phrases such as, well, let's flip that thinking, or there is another way of looking at it. Have you considered it from another person's perspective? All very collaborative, actually, but that's kind of the style that I've built up over the years.
Right. And has anyone ever asked you to change your style or commented on it?
Yeah, so I've had experiences where actually when I have been much more direct and much more assertive, I usually find that people take real offence to it.
Right.
When you see that mirrored by a male colleague, it's sort of accepted, well, that's just how they speak. Whereas when a woman does it, it comes across as, well, that's not okay in the workplace. But actually, it's the same behaviours.
Yeah, thanks. Jo, you're nodding.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting, isn't it? So generally, I think I try and be collaborative in the workplace in particular. But when I am directive, I hope people realise that there's kind of, you know, I've got to that point, a decision needs to be made. I need to be really clear in what happens, and sometimes it's because actually I can see, you know, try and see the reactions, or somebody else will ask me and just say, Jo, what do we need to do? But equally, sometimes it's kind of like when I mean business, you know, and sometimes it is when I'm kind of, that's it. I think the discussion is over. We need to, you know, sort of get to a decision point on this. And interestingly, I did get a bit of feedback quite a few years ago now from somebody, and I think I take this as a compliment, because they said I managed to give them a bit of a telling off, but without them realizing until they'd reflected on what I'd said, and they were like, oh, actually she, and you know, so I think I take that as a compliment in terms of it wasn't wagging fingers, but it was direct.
Yeah, it does sound like a compliment to me, that it was they just received it as feedback.
Yeah.
Bev, do you have something to
I think
add?
very similar to Jo, really. I think my style would be more collaborative, but there are times when you do need to be you know, directive, and I think what I like to do is probably put a positive spin on things as well. Very much so, rather than looking at the negative things and what we can't do and what we can't achieve, actually turn that round to a positive and try and bring people with you then at that point as well.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so it's kind of collaborative up to a point, and then the kind of the importance of clarity comes in. Yeah. Anuradha, did you have anything to because I know I recognise you're not in a position of leadership particularly yet, but
yeah, no, not yet. But yeah, I agree with what everyone's saying about how there's like time and place for different leadership styles. Like I'm sure in like collaborative leadership styles would be very useful if there was a task that I could develop like my personal interests, or I could be a bit more creative with like the type of work I'm doing. But yeah, directive leadership styles when there's like a task that needs to be done and you already know the steps that I can do to actually complete something. So yeah.
Right.
But I appreciate what Carol said. Yeah. But I appreciate what Carol said about how being judged unfairly because you're breaking like those stereotypes that people already have of you.
Right. Yeah. So while we're using these with those language modifiers that we were talking about, in a way, then they do serve to diminish power, but they also, to a certain extent, serve to be accepted, which is also important in leadership and collaboration. Yeah. So I'm also wondering about is there a difference between how you manage men and women, those of you who are managers, and the language and style that you use? Carol's nodding.
I'm nodding. Yeah, I thought long and hard about this because I really want to think that because I'm aware of that unconscious bias that I don't do it. But I know I do it. I know that I treat my male and female colleagues and direct reports differently. That said, I do think that compassion and care towards others should not be defined by gender. But it absolutely is. And there are times when I'll catch myself out. I'll give myself a talking to. But the more I learn about gender bias, the more I find myself trying to treat people the same and call other people out on it as well.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, Jo.
Yeah, I'm a bit like Carol. I'd really like to think, you know, that I treat everybody equally, regardless of the gender. But I think it's all about building relationships up with people, isn't it? And getting to know people. And I think it's that, you know, shared passions or, you know, shared values and that thing that connects you to people. So I probably do find that, you know, my sort of female colleagues I connect to in a different way than I connect to my male colleagues, just because of maybe shared experiences and things like that.
Yeah. And you're just responding. Yeah, carry on.
Sorry, I was just going to add as well that you know, obviously in a male-dominated environments, I've had quite a few scenarios where when I have showed a male colleague the same compassion that I would a woman, they've actually been blown away by the response because they're not used to being treated in that way. And you know, I then find they're in a position where they're embarrassed because they've had tears, or you know, they're really trying to hold their emotions in, but you know, I then come along and go, it's okay, you know, let those emotions out. But they find that quite hard. But yeah, so sometimes it's important to treat people the same, but understand that there are differences in how they're receiving that too.
Yeah, and certainly it's empathy is you know, empathy in the workplace is pretty radical, really. It's not, especially in male-dominated spaces, and teaching people to, my experience, teaching people to drive trucks, then they're often so relieved to see a woman. because they feel safe to be nervous with a woman, which they might not in the same way. So actually so kind of collaborative and empathic approaches, you know, it's of value for everybody. Yeah. Bev, I wonder if you've got anything to add to that.
Yeah, I think so. I've thought about this, and I think that I do treat both my male and female colleagues the same and communicate with them in the same way. It'll be interesting on reflection to understand what their view of that is, I think. But I really do think that I would treat them exactly the same.
Yeah.
On how I communicate with them.
Yeah, thank you. Anuradha, do you notice any difference in the way they communicate? Yeah.
Yeah, so Kiara's just said in the chat, she wrote, should we not treat people with equity rather than equality? Should men and women be treated differently because they have different needs? And I think that kind of relates to what Carol said about how when she treated someone with like additional compassion that she would have been normally treating her female direct reports with, how it shouldn't just be about gender, but how am I saying this? So what Kiara is saying about how men and women might have different needs, it should also be based on like the individual's needs, because it's not always like so right and wrong, is it?
Yeah, it's not necessarily that cut and dried. Yeah. Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much. Right, let's get on to the second poll. So we'll have a quick look at some of the chat while people are answering. So the second poll is about how others perceive you.
Can you see my screen?
Yes,
Perfect.
thank you. Yeah, so a colleague is in a lift with a new team member. So picture this scene. The new starter asks your colleague, "What are you like?" What do you want your colleague to say? So while people are thinking of that, we're going to gradually get a word cloud up. So I'm wondering, how would you answer that question? Let's start with Anuradha. You're on mute.
Sorry. Yeah, the same, like someone said, approachable, agreed, and helpful, probably compassionate and supportive to more junior members of staff. Yeah, competent has come up. I agree with that.
Thank you. Yeah, so the kind of the interpersonal, the human interaction things are kind of important, about being approachable and helpful, and yeah,
but then I guess it is true that it's a balance between also being like competent and creative and knowledgeable as well.
Yeah, thank you. What about Jo?
Well, do you know what? I was really pleased to see friendly come up first, because I was like, oh yes, that's definitely something I would use, or I'd like to hope that somebody would use to describe me. Equally approachable as well, and I know it's right in the middle of the screen, and try not to get too influenced by what's coming up there. But I think it is that those more sort of empathetic descriptions. Clearly, I would like it if somebody said I was competent. That's always helpful. But certainly, you know, definitely on the sort of friendly and approachable and a good listener. I think that's also something I'd really, really like them to say about me.
Yeah, excellent. Bev.
Yeah, I think very similar, really. I think probably kind, approachable, a good listener, friendly, as well as being, competent. You like to think yourself that you are, and knowledgeable as well, I suppose, in your field, and lead in that area.
Yeah, thank you. Carol.
Yeah, so I wrote a sentence which was, as a capable leader who puts the interest of everyone at the heart of decision making. I'm an operations manager, but I think that there's a subtle difference between a leader and a manager. I think that I would like to I hope that people see that I encourage them to do a good job rather than telling them what to do. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so let's have a look at this, the word cloud. So we've got approachable has been right in the middle the whole way through, hasn't it? And friendly and helpful and kind are close by. But also these kind of knowledgeable, professional, competent, they seem to be the next in terms of importance. They seem to be the next one out, which is great. Collaborative, compassionate. Does anyone have any comments on what they're seeing in the word cloud? Does anything surprise them? Or not? Bear in mind the makeup of women in transport. Bev, you got any? Oh, Carol just unmuted. Yeah.
I was about to say I'd be curious what a male version of this cloud would look like. I feel like there's a lot of kind of emotional words in there, which is absolutely fine. I wonder if they'd be fewer when it came to the male version of this cloud.
Yeah. Yeah. A number of people have said in the chat that someone said that Rebecca said that they're passive phrases, and there seems to be a theme of wanting to be liked. However, relationships are very important at work, and so the importance of building relationships, everything else can flow much more easily. Leadership and creativity can flow much more easily when the relationships are good. Yeah. Anybody else got any comments on it? Yeah, Jo?
Yeah. So a male friend of mine described me and another lady as brilliant and wonderful the other day, and you know what, I can't see those words on this cloud, but we should all describe ourselves as brilliant and wonderful because we all are. But it's interesting, isn't it? Because this is, like you say, much more sort of empathetic, compassionate, but actually some of those kind of words would really, I think, fit into this cloud as well, and are missing.
And also, I suppose, what would in order for someone to feel safe to say those words, then that would be another a level of kind of being comfortable with self-promotion that we often see as it's not feminine, it's not the way that we should be. Yeah. Anuradha, have you got any comments on the word cloud?
Yeah, so I just wanted to draw on what Kristen said in the chat about how women having an expectations of providing emotional labour, of being caring within the team, which can be exhausting. And I think that's quite an important point to when we're talking about how we would like to be viewed in the workplace as being like approachable and supportive, and about how the differences between if a man would have the same interest in those qualities and how that like reflects on how our labour is shared in the workplace.
Yeah. That automatically, if someone's upset, then it's expected that a woman's gonna go and sort them out. Yeah. Yeah, thanks. Bev, have you got any comments on this?
Yeah, I thought it was quite interesting around the self-promotion, and that doesn't come very easily. I don't think that's ever really come very easily to me and probably my colleagues as well, whereas that seems to be readily available, certainly to some of my male colleagues who are quite happy to put themselves and promote themselves in a different way. So I think perhaps we need to reflect on that a little bit and do some work on that area.
Yeah, on the self-promotion. Yeah. And finding ways to, rather than it being about saying, aren't I great, but it's about just celebrating what you've achieved and what and being proud of yourself. Yeah. Without it coming across as arrogant, which is entirely possible, I think. Yeah. Okay. So I think this is all going to be hopefully available, certainly on the recording. So let's go on to another question. So what would be your top tips for getting your voice heard in a male-dominated setting? I'll start with Bev.
That's quite an interesting one. So I've been in lots of meetings, I suppose, and I'm the only female. And I think I've become frustrated sometimes when you haven't been heard. And I have been in rooms where I've sort of literally sort of stood up and sort of waved my hand because I'm people are sort of passing me by. So I think perseverance, I think probably sometimes has worked, and just trying to be that present, if you like, sort of trying to make yourself heard, putting your hand up, and but it isn't always very easy, and I have been frustrated at times when you've sort of been sidelined. But quite tricky.
And is there something that you, if you are in that situation, is there something that you tell yourself to support yourself to stay present?
I think probably, yeah, I have got something important to say. I need to say it. I need to get my view across. So that makes me a bit more determined. And I have been known to, I think, not cut across, but I'm waiting for a pause and a breath to be able to sort of nearly butt in. But it's a split second, an opportunity, and then I think it's probably having the confidence which I've got as I've grown in my career, actually, that actually it is worth me, making that point and getting myself heard, because otherwise you're just sat back and you walk out, and then you're even more frustrated because actually you haven't been heard and you haven't got your views or your message across.
Yeah, thank you. Anuradha?
Yeah, so I just wanted to say also that it's about the other people in the room. I think sometimes like the onus can fall on women or people from other marginalized communities to like when we're facing stereotypes and like structures of racism and sexism and everything, that we have to face it ourselves. But I just wanted to put some of the onus on to our allies, that it shouldn't just be us all the time. And the importance of having good mentors early in your career, like to help build your confidence in maybe male dominated places, but in general as well, and advice on skill development and advocating for your competency when you're not in the room.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Joe, you're nodding. I was wondering if what would be your top tips? And also, as a leader, is there something that you do to make sure that all voices are heard?
So I think I totally agree with Bev, and I think I've probably done it myself where I've sat in a meeting and not had the confidence to to make a point, or felt I could have said something afterwards. I think we all find that, don't we? We think, oh, could have oh, that point was great, and you think of it sometime afterwards. I think there's a bit about practice and experience, and you build up that confidence over time. In particular, the meetings you go to, and how the kind of your standing, what you feel, how you feel you can contribute to the meeting, and that reflection as well, and not being hard on ourselves. So it might be that we kind of walk out of a meeting and think, oh well, actually, I could have said that, and maybe, but next time, there's always a next time. And even if you say one thing or do a thumbs up or something like that, that is just as powerful as as any comment. So I think we have to reflect and build and grow, which is really important. I think in terms as a leader, making sure everybody's heard. So as I've sort of got more experience, particularly around chairing, is trying to make sure, so if you're in a room with people, is just looking around, that eye contact, and just checking through that you've picked up everybody's who wants to speak. To be honest, it's a lot easier on Teams, because you can actually see all the hands up and everything. So it is. But I think it's just about that, as chair or, whatever, you can take control, and you're the leader. So have that confidence, and, always make sure, just offer out, has anybody got anything else that they'd like to add? And, and also maybe setting ground rules at the start of the meeting. Every contribution is valuable. And I think that's really important to understand. And again, just having that confidence about raising a point. And there's nothing wrong with saying that your point is that you agree with somebody else, because that affirmation and that support is also really valuable.
Lovely, thank you. Carol?
I think was it Anuradha who said earlier on about having an ally in the room, and I think that's really important, because sometimes they'll see a subtle body language that you've done that frustration that you've not got something across. And knowing that they're in the room means that they can maybe invite you into the conversation, which is a little bit less uncomfortable than feeling like you're butting in. And also I use the phrase, I'd like to take the conversation back. So if the conversation's moved on, sometimes I will take the conversation back to where I wanted it to be. That's quite a useful phrase.
And how has that been received?
Often quite well. Sometimes I actually get apologies for, oh, sorry, we didn't realise you had a point to make. And then I go to, you know, whoever's chairing the meeting. That's a learning point for them, isn't it? That they need to check with everybody that everybody has finished or has got across what they wanted to say.
Yeah, thank you. And have you ever called it out when someone was actively, persistently speaking over you? And what do you need in order to have the confidence to do that? Does anyone have an experience rather than going individually? Bev's nodding, yeah.
Yeah, so I think if I'm aware but the chair isn't aware, I will say, I think so and so that person has got something to add, and I will try and bring them in. Probably more so now I'm in a more senior role, so I've probably got the more confidence to do that myself now. But probably just being more aware of the people in the room, and that recognizing that they do want to speak up.
Yeah. And have you called it out on your own behalf?
No, I don't think I have.
Yeah. Anyone
Maybe
else?
I should have done.
Well, I'm just thinking about what's actually required and just how difficult it is to go against what's the kind of the conventional narrative of how things are supposed to go. Yeah, how risky, personally vulnerable it feels to call something out. Yeah, Jo, you're nodding.
Well, yeah, because I tend to sort of try and let people finish talking. I'm very polite in that respect. Maybe too polite sometimes on reflection, and again, it's part of kind of continual learning and sort of confidence, because I think actually to try and sort of butt in, either you've got to wait for somebody to take a breath and get in there quickly with "and I'd like to add," or you've got to kind of try and interrupt them really politely and say, "Can I just make a point?" or, you know, something like that. But I think it is one of those ones, it really comes with experience and confidence, and I find it really difficult, to be honest.
Yeah, thanks. Carol, got anything about calling people out?
I think it's just, again, it's experience, isn't it? And having the confidence. I often find my thoughts don't that they're not as quick to get to my mouth. So sometimes my thoughts are still there. So yeah, sometimes the opportunity to call it out isn't actually there in the meeting, but that doesn't mean that you've missed an opportunity, because you can always speak to the person later on in the day. They might not have realised that they were doing it, and that will help them for next time.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Anurada, have you had an experience of having to call anyone out or call them in? So generally calling people out is in front of others, calling people in is one-to-one. Yeah.
Not really, but I do agree with what Carol said about how there's like the follow-up times, because it's what we said earlier about how when you reflect on a meeting and you feel a bit self-conscious that maybe you've missed an opportunity, then I think that's a good way to address that and not leave the meeting feeling worried about it.
Yeah, so always just taking that opportunity to just own what it is that you wanted to contribute and find another way of doing it if the group meeting was not the way that was working at that moment for you. Okay, thank you very much. Let's see if we've got some questions from the floor. I'm wondering, Victoria, have you collated some, or shall I have a look at the chat?
Yeah, no, so the chat is super busy, but what I did is that I've opened the Q&A section and I've moved, I think I've moved there are 3 there, so there are 3 questions there. I can read you the first one and we can go with that, and then we can, if you want to,
Yes.
Can you see the Q&A or do you want me to read it?
Yeah, I can see the Q&A, yeah.
Perfect.
So the first one is from how do we re-engineer the minds of men when they have been programmed since birth to behave a certain way? And I think maybe
that's
we could.
from a male. That question is from a male, actually.
Yeah, and that's good. And I think maybe we could extend that to not just be about men, but also just people in a position of privilege. So, so for white people and others in a position of privilege as well. Yeah, Jo, what would you say to that?
Oh, I mean, it's a hard one to do, but I think you know, I think it's all about that representation. So we, you know, I would say as a white female, I am in a position of relative power of being white, and therefore understanding other people's experiences and having those conversations and empathy. So I think there is that thing about exposure to others, their experiences, and again that point about listening. It's not a kind of token thing. It has to be a genuine and, you know, conversation, understanding and appreciation, and then, you know, what do you do about it?
Yeah, thank you. Carol.
I was going to add to that, just be curious, really curious, and just think about every interaction you have and every interaction that you see, male on male, male on female, female on female, and just be curious. A powerful phrase is, would that happen to a man? You know, if you ask a question and you ask that question to a male and a female, does it make sense to both? Because if it does, then that's okay. And if not, then rethink the question, would be my advice.
Yeah. Thank you. Anuradha.
Yeah, so I think aside from those like unconscious bias trainings, and I guess I'm part of that, because if it is because of unconscious bias, which we could say it is, it's like breaking those stereotypes and maybe expanding the types of people you speak to, just in general, the types of shows you watch, the type of like media, the books you read, and things like that. Maybe that can help break down the stereotypes that we've all learned. And I guess it's also just don't doubt people if they come to you and say, oh, this like microaggression has happened in the workplace and I feel upset about it. Then you can be the person to be like, no, that's wrong, I'll report it, or take a next step, obviously if that's what they want you to do. But yeah, just being supportive of your non-white and people in marginalized communities.
Yeah, so yeah, work on the principle that believe people when they say it.
Believe people.
Yeah.
And I think because it's like the wider like inequalities that we have as a whole that feed into the workplace. So it's like breaking your own biases outside of work. That'll help us all at work.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Bev.
I think that's just about opening your minds a little bit more, isn't it, to what's out there, and putting yourself in a position that you're exposed to perhaps some of the things that you perhaps don't feel comfortable or that are outside of what would be normal for you. I think probably to help you understand that a bit better.
Yeah, and I think as an important thing is that we didn't, this system of you know, kind of hierarchies of race and gender and inequalities, we didn't actually create it, but we do recreate it. Whether we like it or not, we do recreate it. And so if you do, I generally think if you are in a position of privilege and someone calls you out in some way, then it's not necessarily a personal thing. It's just you are just receiving feedback on what you have done to recreate this system. And so it's because often the first response is actually defensiveness, and that no one can learn if they're in a position, if they're feeling defensive, if they experience the defensiveness. And so rather to try and overcome the defensiveness, if you can think instead of, okay, right, I didn't want that to happen, I didn't do this on purpose, however I did, and so this is just a matter of kind of an opportunity to learn. Yeah. Okay, so there's a question about calling out.
There is a question for Carol. If you scroll down, it's the second question. So I don't know if you want to pick that one up.
Yeah, so Carol, you mentioned calling out bias when you see it. Can you tell us a bit more about how you can do that? Because it can be hard.
Absolutely. It can be hard, and it can be hard particularly when you're the one receiving that bias. So I'll give you a really simple example. I arrived at work a couple of weeks ago, and as I was saying hello to everybody, someone said, "Oh, here comes the boss lady." Right. In my head was, what's different between a boss and a boss lady? Why did they have to call me a boss lady rather than a boss? So actually I said to them, well, what makes me different? Why am I not just a boss? And by doing it there and then, I saw his expression when he had to think, because he actually genuinely didn't know. But what was going through my mind as the boss lady was, well, if he sees me as a boss lady, what does he see differently to me, to my colleague who's a boss? So sometimes it's as straightforward as doing it there and then, but that is something that you need to be comfortable with. If you're not comfortable with that, then it is a case of calling it in, which we talked about earlier, which is leaving it for later on in the day, or when there's a moment, because sometimes calling it out in the moment can actually be embarrassing for the other person. You don't want to do that either. So it's finding that fine balance of making sure that you get your chance to speak up about something that you've just experienced, or you might have witnessed somebody else experience, and making sure that there's an opportunity to learn, because I think there's always an opportunity to learn.
Yeah, thank you. Jo?
I just was smiling when Carol said about being called boss lady, because I think I've had like Mrs. Boss Lady, but I think it's all about knowing people. So in those instances, I've not been offended, or I've not thought, oh, this is different, because actually I know the person who is kind of addressing me in that way, and I know it's not meant as a kind of specific, it's just how they see me or whatever, but I think it's really interesting to reflect on some of, on phrases like that, and do people think it's different, the boss lady versus the boss? And one guy used to call me mom, which I quite liked as well, and but I never saw him calling other people sir, for example. So it's interesting, isn't it, a language? But again, it does all boil down to the relationships you've got with those people, and that comfort, and then I think that safe space, that if you are able to sort of call out, but in the right way, that you can kind of address, how people are maybe addressing you or thinking about you, or perceiving you.
Yeah, thank you. Anuradha, have you got an experience of calling someone out?
I don't know, but I agree with Jo that it would be about the type of relationship that you have and that level of comfort, and how we can approach this situation.
Yeah, okay. So it's often about the kind of the relationships, isn't it? And Bev?
Very similar to Jo, really. I think there have been times I don't think I've really called people out, but I've got relationships with people and I haven't been offended. So I think very similar to Jo on this one.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we've got one more poll. There's some really interesting stuff in the chat about calling people out, and also just kind of, it's useful to remember that not all men are bad, and absolutely, I think we've all had some wonderful experiences of male allyship and beautiful male leadership, and kind of empathic leadership styles are becoming much more widespread among everybody. So what has been your key takeaway from our discussion today?
Jenny, while we're waiting for the results, there is a really interesting question. So we appreciate all the questions, everybody, but there is one that says, describe your ideal leader. Could we address that quickly?
Okay, that would be brilliant. Yeah, that'd be a nice ending one. So yes, describing your ideal leader. Just close down the chat so that I can see you all again. Let's go for Anuradha.
Yeah, so it's kind of what we said before about having like a balance between different leadership styles. So having the collaborative leadership style when I have time and the task lends itself to a bit more creativity, but then being in other circumstances when we really need to get the job done, or there is a more set instructions that I can follow, then just depends what the task is, really.
Thank you. Yeah. Jo?
I was trying to think of somebody, but I can't think of off the top of my head kind of a role model. But you know, somebody who's kind of like welcoming, inclusive, creative, directive, and empathetic. So I think, you know, it's quite a lot of things to cover, but just that rounded person and somebody who is a good listener, for me, that's really key.
Yeah, thank you. Bev?
I think somebody who's supportive as well in what you're doing, so that you feel like you have the support and that empowers you then to get on in your role. I think that's a really important one for me.
Thank you.
I also just have something quickly to add.
Yeah.
I just saw some of the key takeaways to say about like to stop saying sorry and to stop using opening phrases. And I just wanted to just question whether we should also just judge whether by self-modifying and getting rid of all these language modifiers when we maybe don't really need to, that maybe us saying sorry at some points is just being extra polite and taking into account other people's feelings in the conversation, and whether we're actually just being a bit unnecessarily insecure and like self-aware than we actually don't really need to be. And so maybe we should also be focusing on developing our skills and just hope that other people don't always stereotype us when we use these language modifiers.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. And Carol, quickly, so your ideal leader?
I'm going to echo everything that everybody said. An ideal leader for me is someone that actually cares for everybody, because everybody's going to bring something to the table. And if you care for everybody and everybody's looked after, you've got that, the people can be themselves, and by being themselves, you're always going to get better ideas brought to the table. And, you know, it takes a team, doesn't it? It's not always about one individual.
Yeah. Excellent, thank you. I've just seen a lovely comment in the key takeaways is that I am not alone as a female leader wrestling with some of this stuff. So that's a lovely thing for somebody to be able to take away from our discussion today. So thank you very much, everybody, both for the speakers and the participants. And I think I'm just going to hand over to Jill briefly to just say goodbye.
Yeah, thank you all. It was a great thought-provoking session, and you know, the sharing of the sort of stories that you have, experiences that you have, I think it's invaluable. I think it's very rich. We did this virtually, as I think I mentioned at the start, and I know that there was a lot of people that were joining for a long period of time. We managed to get up to nearly 200 attendees, which is fantastic. We had this as one of our initial events around the launching of the Southwest regional hub for women in transport. This is a little taster of some of the sort of events that not only the regional hub does, but also that nationally women in transport do. But and I know that many of you are from the Southwest, and there are some that would be very interested maybe in pursuing getting more involved in the regional hub. Well, there's some great opportunities coming up. So just as a slight segue, we did have an initial meeting back in March in Bristol. We're trying to be as inclusive as we can, and we're going to propose a kind of a networking, a sort of mince pie, pre-Christmas type networking, late November, early December in the Exeter area. So details will be shared. And then we're looking at a sort of a formal launch in February of next year, where the Southwest regional hub will be launched properly. So thank you all for coming. Please keep in touch, and I look very much forward to sort of catching up with everyone and seeing you all again soon. Thank you all, speakers, panelists. You were wonderful.
Is everyone okay to stay for 2 minutes?
There's a couple of questions about how to make sure we're on the mailing list. Okay, so we will be putting some information out on social media, but we will also, I mean, there is a page on the Women in Transport, there's an events page. So if you sign up or log into Women in Transport, then that will give you a bit more information, and also about the richness of other things that are going on around the other regions as well. Please excuse me, I'm full of cold.
Okay.
I think have you ended the recording, Victoria?
I did, yeah. I'm going to stop it now. So, recording, stop recording.